So let me introduce Father Dan Horan, our speaker.
He is a Franciscan friar of the Holy Name Province and a Duns Scotus Chair of Spirituality at Catholic Theological Union in Chicago. He's a columnist at the National Catholic Reporter, and he's an author of 12 books. And the two that really sort of struck me were this one, All God's Creatures, A Theology of Creation, and Reading, Praying, Living, Pope Francis, Rejoice and Be Glad. Father Dan regularly lectures, and he is lecturing for us today, and serves on a number of boards, including St. Bonaventure University and the Franciscan School of Theology. And he's a co-host of a podcast called The Francis Effect. I also wanted to thank him for joining us, because he is he waived a speaking fee for us at this point. So let me stop sharing this. So Father Dan, why don't I hand it off to you? And what I would like everybody to do who is in the chat room, welcome again if you missed the beginning of this. What I would like you to do is turn off your video, your outgoing video. It's at the bottom left-hand side of the screen. If you can stop your video, it'll give more bandwidth to the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Marika, and thank you everybody who's joining us. I'm really delighted to be with you, and it's a great honor. I want to give a shout out to all the folks in the Diocese of Ogdensburg who made this possible. This happens to also be a kind of satellite diocese or local church for my immediate family. My parents have a camp just south of the Adirondack Park and worship in parishes of the diocese. So thank you to Marika and all those who are on the Celebrate Laudato Si week-long celebration planning committee and who have made this possible. And to Bishop LaValle and all those in the Chancery. It's really delightful to be with you. So I'm going to go ahead now and share with you my, oh, you might hear that in the background. If you do, that's the thunderstorm that's coming through Chicago, which means in about 24 hours or so, it may hit you all in northern New York. So if you hear some rain, that's, as we saw in the Canticle of the Creatures, our sister water joining us from above. So the theme is really to focus on celebrating the community of creation, God's community of creation, 5 years after Laudato Si, as you see here. And to give you just a sense of what I'd like to do in the time that I have to offer some remarks, a little presentation before we take questions and answers, is to do the following. I want us just to take a moment to look at what the church calls the signs of our times. And here we get this admonition, this exhortation from the Second Vatican Council in the Constitution on the Church in the Modern World that says that we as Christians are called to scrutinize, to look at the signs of our times, the world around us, and to interpret these signs, these realities, in the light of the gospel. So we're going to do that briefly and see that as a setup for what the Holy Father has done in the encyclical that was published 5 years ago this year. Then, because I don't expect everybody to necessarily, even though it's been 5 years that it's been out, have had the opportunity to read the encyclical letter, I want to offer just a brief overview of the text to kind of ground everybody with a familiarity with it, and then look at two different things. One is the challenge that Pope Francis presents to the church, and I'm going to offer just a little insight, a little snippet. There's so much more to unpack, and we can do that further in the Q&A and in this week as we take time to reflect on this document. And then I'd like to offer us an invitation to see the challenge that we have received, and in other words, how we're called to move forward in light of this teaching, in light of the signs of our times, in light of the world in which we find ourselves. And then we have some time for a Q&A, and we have Tom, who's going to be monitoring the chat function. So if you have questions as I'm proceeding in my presentation, please feel free to type those in, and we'll have some time to interact after that. Let's see here. There we go. So first the signs of the times, and I'd like to highlight in particular, some of the events that have happened just in the last few years. This is a satellite view from the International Space Station of Hurricane Harvey that devastated the Gulf of Mexico, and in particular the greater Houston area in Texas. You can see the massive size of this particular storm. Here are some shots. One of the things that Pope Francis highlights in the encyclical is that those most vulnerable, those who are already in the most precarious situations, the poor, the vulnerable, elderly folks in particular, are the most likely to suffer and to suffer most immediately. And we see here with the flooding and Hurricane Harvey that the homeless and senior citizens in particular were very hard hit. I think, of course, of the United States West and Pacific Northwest. This is a shot, a very startling shot of wildfires in California in September of 2017. And those who've been following along in recent years, it has only gotten worse. This is also true to our neighbors in the north. And for you in Ogdensburg, the north is not that far away. Here I'm thinking of our friends in Canada, particularly in the regions of Alberta, and in the Plain States. There have been a number of wildfires that have been devastating and have only increased in their kind of fervor. We see in 2017, there was a very serious drought that affected India. Hundreds of thousands of people have suffered as a result of that. You may recall back in 2011, the huge tsunami that hit Japan and affected one of the power stations, very, very devastating as well. I'd like to highlight here something Pope Francis said on September 10th, just a few years ago in 2017, as he was flying back from an apostolic visit, when he was asked about the urgency of global climate change, of the concerns that are before us. And in particular, folks were asking him, journalists were asking him about remarks that certain, oftentimes political figures or celebrity figures have raised about whether or not there's a concern of global climate change, whether or not this is overblown, whether there's a scientific consensus and so forth. And the Holy Father, in his typical directness, said the following. He says, "You see the effects of climate change, and scientists have clearly said what path we have to follow. All of us have a responsibility, all of us, small or large, a moral responsibility. Each person has their own. Even politicians have their own. If someone is doubtful that this is true, they should ask scientists. They are very clear. These are not opinions made on the fly." And I think it's an important place to begin there, because when we look at Laudato Si, the Holy Father isn't just offering a reflection kind of in a pie in the sky way. This isn't just merely a theoretical abstraction, but he takes seriously, as we've begun in this presentation this afternoon, what we call the signs of the times. Things like increased natural disasters, increased extinction rates among species, greater pollution, greater problems that surface in all sorts of areas. It's not that the human impact on the planet. Oh,
Rosana or Rosalba?
Somebody
is unmuted. Hang on.
I think we might need to mute yourself on mute for the sake of everybody's ability to hear. So what the Holy Father is doing, of course, is responding using the gospel, using our shared faith to read these signs of our times that scientists and climatologists and others are highlighting as very serious, as very devastating. It's not that the human impact on on the globe and on global climate change is creating absolutely new phenomena, though that's sometimes the case. It's that, as we saw in 2017 with Hurricane Harvey, it's that things that would ordinarily take place have gotten worse. And we see it as well with wildfires in the West, and we see this with floods and other what we call natural disasters. So what I'd like to do to kind of get us started is just a refresher, and I'm going to try my best to be brief in offering a review, an overview of Laudato Si. This is, I like to say when I talk about this encyclical, this is one of my favorite slides. There's a lot of text here. I apologize for that. That's kind of a violation of the original, it's a kind of the original sin of PowerPoint, too much text. But this does, in one slide, provide an overview of the entire encyclical letter of the Holy Fathers, and it's something like well over 200 paragraphs. Just as a reminder, the audience is really important, and some of us were chatting before we went live this afternoon about the audience and the connection that the Pope's teaching on behalf of the Universal Church has reached. It's not just for Catholics, it's not just for baptized Christians. In fact, one of the things that Pope Francis does is he addresses this teaching to all who share our common home. And what he does is build on something that Pope John the 23rd did in his encyclical letter Pacem in Terris, or Peace on Earth, back in the 1960s. John the 23rd wrote this encyclical letter back in the 60s about world peace, about violence in the world, about the Cold War, about the rise of conflict in Vietnam. And he was addressing what he saw as a global crisis. And so he broadens the audience from just Catholics or just Christians to what John the 23rd called all women and men of goodwill. And I like to joke, but it's actually quite serious, that Pope Francis actually expands that further. So dire are the circumstances of global climate change and the realities before us that he's not just addressing people of goodwill or possible people to partner with. He's addressing everybody. You could be a person of bad will. You can be somebody who is disinterested or kind of aloof, and he's still trying to reach you. That's how serious the circumstances are before us. So there are 6 chapters in the encyclical letter. There's a short introduction in which the Holy Father places this teaching alongside his predecessor's teaching, going back to Leo XIII at the end of the 19th century, and builds on what we call Catholic social teaching. He identifies Laudato Si as a formal, instantiated, authoritative doctrine within the church. It's not up for grabs. It has the same weight as some of the highest teaching that the church has taught, with authority that is what we'd call non-infallible. It doesn't mean that it's up for grabs. It doesn't mean people can choose it or leave it. This is part of what we as Catholic Christians believe. And then he goes on to highlight these 6 chapters. The first is, he asks the question, what is happening? And draws on the latest science and draws on the latest research and consults a number of leading scholarly bodies of researchers and scientists to highlight the circumstances that we find ourselves in. This is what we talk about when we talk about the signs of our times. And he makes a bold claim. He says that when it comes to the current status of the environment, there's no question. It's not up for debate. It's not if there is not global climate change. The only real question is, what are we going to do as a species, as a human family, as a church in response to it? The second chapter is what Pope Francis calls the gospel of creation. And here he draws from the great well of resources in our Catholic Christian tradition. So one thing he highlights is Scripture, and how Scripture has been misinterpreted, misused over the centuries and over the decades to justify a lot of the practices that we humans have used to harm one another and to harm the rest of the created world. And he calls for a better interpretation, or exegesis. I'll say more about that in just a little bit. He also revisits the theological tradition. And instead of using just the same old sources over and over again, and here, as you can tell from my outfit, I have to represent my Franciscan brothers and sisters, that this document draws heavily from the Franciscan intellectual tradition and draws from theologians and doctors of the church like Saint Bonaventure, a medieval theologian and former professor at the University of Paris, who went on to become a bishop and then a cardinal and a saint and a doctor of the church. More often than not, church documents tend to draw from the wisdom and great insight of somebody like St. Thomas Aquinas, a Dominican friar and theologian, who was a contemporary of St. Bonaventure's. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what Pope Francis does in this teaching is draw from a broader array and says, you know what? Let's not just narrow our focus on somebody like Thomas. Let's look at other resources. And he draws very heavily from the Franciscan tradition. So he resources them in a new way. If we look at chapter 3, we see one of the chapters that upset quite a bit of people back in 2015 here in the US context. And that's because of the politicizing of climate change. Not that this is unique only to the United States, but this is something sadly that we face and sadly continue to face, where there is so-called climate deniers and there are political divisions that tend to focus on whether or not this is a real thing, how we're going to address it, and so forth. A lot of the other parts of the world recognize what the consensus of scientists and others have highlighted, which is that there is a human root to the crisis in which we find ourselves. And the Holy Father affirms this. He asserts this and says that this isn't really up for question, as I mentioned earlier. And he highlights a number of contributing factors, a number of concerns, one of which is anthropocentrism, which is a way of saying that all the decisions that we make center, that's the centrism part, on the anthropos, or the human person, so that we live our lives more often than not. We make decisions, we make our laws, we establish our economies and our politics based on our own self-interest, individually and collectively as a species, oftentimes without consideration for the rest of God's creation. So that's been a real problem. Another problem Pope Francis highlights is something that is a very, very key theme in all of his teaching and preaching, and that is the danger of indifference. Pope Francis preaches about this on almost a weekly basis in his daily homilies, and he talks about it in almost all of his exhortations and in this encyclical for sure. And what he means is that very few people are, we might say, explicitly out to cause harm or to sin. There aren't that many people. The image I always like to conjure is that there are very few people who are up in the St. Lawrence Seaway, for instance, to think of, your backyard. Very few people in the Diocese of Ogdensburg have a 50-gallon drum of crude oil in their car, driving to the St. Lawrence and decide to dump it in there and deliberately pollute the water, right? Deliberately harm humans and non-human creatures. Pope Francis says that, that's oftentimes not the case. What is more often the case is what he calls indifference or apathy. Most people just don't care. So a lot of the decisions we make, a lot of the things in this world, a lot of the policies we shape are reflective of, I think, again, this human-centeredness, this anthropocentrism, and a general indifference. I don't want to bother with it. Now, he says there are two ways that this plays out. One is that kind of apathy of, kind of disinterest or indifference that's deliberate. It's malicious. I don't want to know. I don't care. But then he also says there's a danger that we need to be mindful of, that because global climate change is so overwhelming, it's such a massive problem, not unlike the global pandemic we're experiencing right now with the coronavirus. Sometimes it seems so daunting that is there anything that I as an individual can do? And Pope Francis says that in the face of such daunting realities, a lot of people, their hearts just shut down and they become indifferent because it feels too overwhelming. And so sometimes people are indifferent because they care. And how we find a balance, how we support one another, how we work through that is really key. The last thing he highlights is that we have for too long over-relied, uncritically relied on technology. A lot of the problems we find ourselves in today, in terms of harm to the environment and environmental crises and so forth, are caused in part by our lack of reflection following and during the Industrial Revolution. And Pope Francis says that technology has oftentimes led to the problems we experience in the world today. We can't just blindly embrace technology as our solution, as kind of the savior to the problem. So that's really important. We're not going to be able to Silicon Valley our way out of this. We're not going to be able to come up with a new app or a new technology. And I could give more examples of how that plays out in a very practical way, but I'm mindful of the time, so maybe we can come back to that. In chapter 4, Pope Francis calls for an integral ecology, and this is so important. Integral ecology. The word ecology comes from the Greek oikos logos. Logos means to talk about, to think about, to understand, and oikos means the household. I always like to point out that if you're a fan, you're all in New York State, or many of you are, and so you probably, if you're going to buy Greek yogurt, choose the Chobani, right? That's the local hometown company. But if you prefer the Dannon version of Greek yogurt, they named it Oikos for some reason. Oikos simply means household. I don't associate Greek yogurt with a household except for a household of probiotic bacteria, I suppose. I don't know. But this idea of ecology isn't simply the study of nature or the study of non-human creation. It really simply means the way we talk about or organize our household, our oikos logos. And Pope Francis says that we need to rethink the way we understand the human ecology and the non-human ecology as integrated, as tied together. And so he calls for a unifying vision. Can we recognize that what we do as a human family, the policies we make, the decisions we make, the actions we choose, has an impact not only on one another in the human family, but also on the non-human family, the rest of creation, and vice versa, that we're reliant on one another, we're interrelated, we're tied to each other. And so we need a unifying vision to reflect that. There's also, he says, a call for intergenerational justice. And this is a term in the Catholic Church that actually dates back to St. John Paul II. John Paul II, in his teaching, talked about this, that we need to make our decisions and our policies and our choices, not just in ways that affect or support or help us right now, even myself or my family or my friends, but can we think many generations down? And this really, I think, echoes well with the wisdom traditions of the First Nations people or the Native Americans in the North American context. Certain tribes have a tradition you may have heard of before called 7 generations, reflecting always on how are the choices we're making as a group today going to affect 7 generations of people later, the great, 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 great grandchildren that none of us will be around to see in this life, but nevertheless, our lives and choices will affect them. The last 2 chapters are important, and really, quite frankly, and not just to kind of pat on the back the Diocese of Ogdensburg, but what we're doing this afternoon and what you'll be doing this week is really living out what the Holy Father calls for in these last 2 chapters. He calls for action. He calls for pragmatic action, not just theoretical action, but how am I going to change my life? How are we going to work together as a community in response to these realities and in response to the gospel call? As well as political engagement. Now, he's not being sectarian. He's not being political in the way that we think about politics in the US context, but he means polis, right? Political is about how we organize our community, the polis, the society. And so we need to engage in the way we make laws, the policies we enact, and so forth. And then finally, education and spirituality. Pope Francis calls for an ecological conversion, a desire that we should all have to transform ourselves to be more and more in tune with God's vision for creation and for our place as part of creation within that broader community, within that family. Okay, that was a little long, I realize, but hopefully that gives you a good grounding. And if you haven't yet read Laudato Si, this week would be a great time to check it out. And this gives you a little taste, a little overview of what you find. I want to turn now just to highlight one key element, and this builds on the overview I just shared. In this, I'm calling this section here, "The Lord has shown me what was mine to do." It comes from a line of St. Francis of Assisi, that near the end of his life, as he was getting close to death, he told his fellow friars, his Franciscan brothers, he said, "The Lord has shown me what was mine to do. May the Lord show you what is yours." In other words, each of us has a different vocation, each of us has a different call, but we do this together as one church, as one human family, as one community. And so this first part is, I want to highlight one of the most important elements of the Holy Father's teaching for us today, and has come through over these last 5 years since the release of Laudato Si. In other words, this is what I believe the Holy Father understood his call to be in teaching the church and reminding the church, reminding us of who we are. And then I want to take a look at what is ours to do. In other words, now that we're 5 years out from Laudato Si, where might the Holy Spirit be leading us forward? Okay. So first, one of the things that the Holy Father points out very, very clearly, and is a constant theme throughout the encyclical, is that the ecological crises that we experience in this world, whether it's global climate change, whether it's extinction of species, whether it's the threat to drinking water and food sources, and temperature regulation, and all these kinds of things that affect all sorts of life, human and non-human alike, these are not simply environmental concerns. Pope Francis here draws from the work of a Brazilian theologian named Leonardo Boff. And Professor Boff was actually a former Franciscan friar. He was an OFM like I am, and left the Franciscan friars, but continued to do theology and is still a Catholic theologian in Brazil. And in 1997, he published a book called Cry of the Earth, Cry of the Poor. And in this, he recognizes that the plight of non-human creation, the struggles, the challenges, the threats that exist to non-human creation are tied to that of the human family. In other words, these two cries, the cry of the earth and the cry of the human poor, are inseparable. And the Holy Father really uses that as a key element for organizing the teaching on care for creation and for how we should structure our societies, our communities. He situates the environmental concerns within the tradition of Catholic social teaching. And he says that this encyclical letter, Laudato Si, is now added to the body of the Church's social teaching. So again, I mentioned this in passing a moment ago, but this is just to reiterate the fact that this is not up for grabs. It's not optional. This is official teaching of the Church. And I think that's important for all of us, people of faith, women and men of faith, to remember, because not everybody's comfortable with some of this teaching. Not everybody wants to accept it. But as we know, as good Christians, a lot of people were very uncomfortable with what Jesus taught, including some of his disciples. And that's because the Christian message is a challenging one. So one of the things Pope Francis does, again, is highlight the unified vision, the integral ecology, the tying together of the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. And he calls us, he challenges us. He says, today, however, we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. So the way that we can't just deal with these kind of siloed, compartmentalized realities, that the way we care for the oceans or care for the forest or care for our waterways and so forth is one thing. And the way we organize our human society is something entirely different. He says it must integrate questions of justice and debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. Again, it's this challenge, it's this call to a unified vision. So as we think 5 years out from the release of this teaching, where are we individually, as parish communities, as local communities and families, as a broader church, and as a diocese, in this case, in the Diocese of Ogdensburg? You're very fortunate in many ways because, well, from my vantage point, I love the Adirondacks. I love so-called upstate New York. For anyone who's in New York City, that's basically anything north of the 5 boroughs. But for what's truly upstate New York, where you are, you do enjoy in many ways, or have the opportunity to enjoy, so much of God's non-human creation. But in what ways do we think about what we do as a human species, as human societies, as local communities, as directly and always tied to the rest of creation? It's worth thinking about. The work isn't finished, and this is what I mean when I say that the Lord has shown Pope Francis what is his to do. He brought together this very powerful, very insightful, very challenging teaching and presents it to the Church, but then there's a challenge for us as well. And the challenge is, may the Lord show us what is ours to do. And I think one of the biggest challenges before us is, again, a theme that is oftentimes reiterated in Laudato Si, and that scientists and church leaders and theologians have highlighted, and that's this persistence of anthropocentrism. This idea that every decision we make, every way we view the world and think about the world centers on how it benefits, affects, inconveniences, or otherwise is related to us. We are at the center of the world, at the center of creation. Now, there's a reason, in part, why we think that way. Part of it is what we say in the Christian tradition is original sin. St. Augustine talks about this reality, this propensity we have as humans to be self-centered. We kind of always want to think of ourselves first. And yet we see in the Bible, in the Hebrew prophets of the Old Testament, we see in the life, death, and resurrection, in the ministry of Jesus, we see in the Gospels, we see in Paul's letters, this challenge, this reminder that God intends us to live another way, even when at times we're drawn to our self-centeredness. But as it pertains to the rest of creation, our place within this broader family of creation, there are different ways that we've thought about from the Christian perspective of creation and our place within it. And over the course of 2,000 years, there have been 3 kind of general headings, 3 different kinds of approaches to thinking about theologies of creation. And we theologians typically call them the following: the dominion model, the stewardship model, and the kinship or community of creation model. And I want just to say a little bit about each of these, because it'll help us to understand how we are carrying a legacy with us, even shaped by our own Christian understanding, that has reinforced a kind of anthropocentrism. It's gotten better, I hope, but it's still a legacy that overshadows and haunts us. Part of it is the dominion model, which is really quite destructive. The dominion model takes one small passage of the book of Genesis and really reads it out of context. And so here, this is your weekend, bonus round of fancy Hebrew words, so that if people ask you on Monday, oh, what did you do yesterday? You can say, I learned these new words in Hebrew. Hrada, which means to have dominion, comes in Genesis 1:26, and kabash, which means to subdue. Now, many of us are familiar with this, especially in the Easter season. If we think back to the Easter Vigil, the first reading comes from the book of Genesis chapter 1. It's the famous account, of course, of the creation of the universe, where we have the 6 days of creation, right? Evening came and morning followed. But toward the end, we have the creation of humanity as well as other creatures. And we have this interesting line that says that God has given human beings dominion over non-human creatures and have been given a kind of mandate to kabash, to subdue the rest of creation. And the way that this has typically been understood or used has been to justify human sovereignty over non-human creation. It has been used from the human perspective, from an anthropocentric lens, to say that God has given us the whole of creation. God has made everything, heaven and earth, for us and handed it over to us so that we can have dominion and therefore dominate the rest of creation. Now, if you're uncomfortable with that image, then you're in good company, because over the centuries, particularly over the last 50 years or so, historians and scientists and theologians and philosophers have all pointed out some very serious problems with this. And for us as Catholic Christians, the Holy Father puts the pun intended, kabash, subdues this incorrect interpretation of Scripture. In paragraph 67 of Laudato Si, Pope Francis says the following. He says, "We are not God." That's always a good thing to remember, of course. He says, "The earth was here before us, and it has been given to us. This allows us to respond to the charge that Judeo-Christian thinking, on the basis of the Genesis account, which grants humanity dominion over the earth," again, Genesis 1:28, "has encouraged the unbridled exploitation of nature by painting men and women as domineering and destructive by nature. This is not a correct interpretation of the Bible as understood by the Church." So what's important there is Pope Francis makes clear that from a Catholic perspective, we cannot embrace a dominion model, that we cannot just misread and take out passages from the Bible to justify human domination of non-human creation. So where does that leave us? Well, the second approach, oftentimes called the stewardship approach, is very common today among Christian communities, Catholic and non-Catholic alike. In fact, the stewardship model of creation is something that's been embraced by non-faith traditions as well, people who are advocates on behalf of the environment, who may not espouse a particular faith tradition or maybe a non-Christian faith tradition. This is certainly an improvement on dominion. The stewardship model says that the planet or the whole cosmos was not in fact created for human use alone. It's not given to us as our property, as something for us to control, to dominate, to waste, to abuse. But rather, God created the universe, and then we as one part of creation have been entrusted with care and cultivation. The way I oftentimes think about it is, we are not the lords of creation, as the dominion model would have it, but rather, from the stewardship perspective, we are called to be the landlords of creation, the kind of housing managers of creation. As the Psalms put it, God owns this planet. We live here within it, and it is our oikos, it is our household, but it is a household that the deed of which does not belong to us, it belongs to God. And therefore, this approach takes, for instance, Genesis chapter 2, which has another creation account where God entrusts humanity with a particular vocation or duty to care for this oikos, to be the gardener, the caretaker, the cultivator of God's creation. And therefore, in this approach, the stewardship model says that we have a vocation as a species to be good stewards of the rest of creation. We are then intermediaries because we are both ha'adamah in Hebrew, which is what Genesis 2 reads. We are made from the earth. Adam means earth. Adamah, ha'adamah means to be created from the earth. And we are also created imago Dei, in the image and likeness of God. Therefore, we serve to kind of represent non-human creation to God. Our Eastern Orthodox Christian brothers and sisters will talk about the human species as a whole, not just ordained priests like myself, presbyters in the church as priests, but the whole of humanity as the priests of creation, that they offer praise and prayer to God on behalf of all of creation. Now, this is definitely an improvement on the dominion approach, because instead of creation being ours to do with as we please, our kind of household that we can wreck if we'd like to, stewardship says that we have a responsibility, a unique role within God's plan for creation, that God owns the planet. It's not up to us. It's not for us to do with as we please. And we can be good or bad stewards, as the scriptural tradition points out. But there's a third approach. And this third approach is called the kinship model. It's a minority tradition. It's a smaller tradition. It's not as well known, but it is as old as the others, in fact, older. And we see echoes of this throughout the Bible. We see this, for instance, in Genesis 2, where we're reminded that God has created us ha'adamah, from the earth. And the fact that we are created from the earth means that we are part of creation. You know, I oftentimes tell my students, when thinking about this, if this is hard to wrap your head around, think about this for a minute. Theologically speaking, there are two categories. There is God and there is not God. What side of that divide are we on? We're on the not God side, along with everything else that God brings into existence. And so as such, we are part of a community. We are kin, as it were. We share a certain cosmic DNA, because as you are sitting there in front of your screens right now, listening to this presentation, your very body, your very physical being is made up of the same things as everything else in creation. The carbon, the oxygen, the nitrogen, all of those things that we share in common. God brought that into existence, has brought us into existence. And this is something that St. Francis of Assisi understood intuitively. And of course, as I say here on my slide, I have to talk about St. Francis. Fortunately, so does Pope Francis. He likes St. Francis a lot, hence the name Pope Francis. But several centuries later, theologians and of course the Holy Father himself have highlighted that actually this kinship model may be really where we're called to be as church, as people, as believers. And so in many ways, St. Francis of Assisi 800 years ago was ahead of the time. But in truth, he was really just one contributor to a long-standing tradition that recognized that we share in a broader family, a community of creation, that we're interdependent, interrelated, that God has given us a particular role as a species, but that other creatures have particular roles too in this world. More on that in just a moment. Sister Elizabeth Johnson, who's a retired professor from Fordham University, she talks about this kinship model very well. She's one of the more recent kind of contemporary theologians to highlight this. And she says, if separation is not the ideal, but connection is, if dualism is not the ideal, but relational embrace of diversity is, if hierarchy is not the ideal, but mutuality is, then the kinship model more closely approximates reality. What she's highlighting here is that the kinship model, if we think about these three approaches to understanding creation and our place within it, the kinship model actually is the truest to God's vision for creation as we see in the Old Testament and in the New Testament and in the church's longstanding tradition. It's just that we have forgotten about it. Why? Well, as Pope Francis points out, we've forgotten about it because we put ourselves in God's place, that anthropocentrism, or we have forgotten about it because we don't want to know, or we don't care, that indifference, or we have forgotten about it because we have distracted ourselves with technology and what have you. So where does Laudato Si fit into these three approaches? I like to call Laudato Si a liminal text. It is an in-between text. Pope Francis makes clear, as I mentioned earlier, that the dominion model is not tenable. It's not justified. It's not a Catholic approach. We have to reject that. So we're left now with stewardship and kinship. In Laudato Si, if you go through and read it, you'll see that there's language of kinship on the one hand. Here, Pope Francis is drawing from the language of St. Francis of Assisi and Franciscan theologians and sacred scripture and the prophets and so forth. But he also oftentimes talks in language that's very reminiscent of stewardship, that we as human beings have a special responsibility to be good stewards and so on and so forth. So in many ways, Laudato Si, I think, is an in-between text. It's a text that summarizes and takes the best of the stewardship approach and calls us to be better stewards of God's creation, of which we are a part, but it also points us toward a deeper understanding of the kinship approach. There's a lot more work to do. And so where do we go from here? The challenge is, I believe, to move beyond the stewardship approach to creation. And how, I think then this has something of an impact on how we treat Laudato Si. And my suggestion is, at this point, especially 5 years out, that we treat Laudato Si as a starting point for the church's understanding of creation and humanity's responsibility and place within it. It's not the end of the conversation. It's not the summary of everything. It is rather this in-between text that pulls the best of the tradition forward and pushes us forward into a new future, into a new way of being in harmony and mutuality with all of God's creatures, with all of creation. Again, I want to quote Sister Elizabeth Johnson. She says, "This kinship attitude does not measure differences on a scale of higher or lower ontological dignity." What she means by ontological dignity is that what's most important isn't first and foremost, who is the top dog? Is it the dog or is it the cat? Or who is the most important person? Is it male or female? Is it this person or that person of this community, of that community, of this country or that country, and so forth? That's this kind of notion of higher or lower dignity that's tied to our being or our categories. She says, but rather, kinship appreciates them as integral elements in the robust thriving of the whole. Can we shift our focus from a pyramid structure that insists that we're on the top as a species? And not that we aren't important or distinctive or unique. I'm not saying that, nor is the church, nor is the Holy Father, nor are any of these theologians we're talking about. But rather, is there another way for us to envision our place in the world? Take, for instance, this particular paradigm, right? Notice, for instance, how there is on the left side, a triangle, right? A very clear pyramid kind of hierarchy. And notice, it's not accidental that the person who drew this put a male on the top, because for so many centuries, so many millennia, men have been seen, or really seen themselves, as higher than women, right? And obviously we see that as problematic, especially in our own day. We've come to a greater awareness of that, even as much as we need to continue working toward greater equality. Nevertheless, look at all these other creatures, right, in this pyramid. Based on our human valuation, we seem to say, well, these creatures are smarter, or we like them more, or they taste better to us, or whatever, what have you, and we kind of rank them. Instead of being focused on that, what if we saw our place within a broader community of creation as interrelated, interdependent? What if we shift our imaginations, think about our ethics, think about how we act in the world according to this way of being? This is where I'd like to propose a thing that comes from the Franciscan tradition that helps us to think about our place within creation. And it's this Latin word pietas. The English is oftentimes translated as piety. And oftentimes if you think of piety or pious people, you might think of people who go to daily mass, or folks who pray the rosary several times a day, or people who love their novenas. They're very faithful to that. They're a pious person. And that's fair. That's a common usage in our modern times. But the Latin word pietas, in its origin, actually refers to something more fundamental. It refers to an ancient virtue, particularly found in the Roman tradition, right? The Roman civil tradition. It was a public virtue. And somebody was pious, exhibited this virtue of pietas when they fulfilled their familial duty, when they were good family members, so that parents were pious when they took care of their children. And spouses were pious when they cared for one another. And children were pious when they cared for their parents and for their siblings and for their children. And everybody responded to one another out of a duty, not an obligation like a job, which is more like stewardship, where you're given a kind of external job or responsibility. But rather, you responded in care for creation out of a sense of pietas, out of familial relationship. Francis of Assisi, according to St. Bonaventure, the, again, medieval Franciscan theologian, was an exemplar of pietas with all of creation. He recognized his interconnectedness, his interrelatedness. I'll give you an example in our modern sense. All of us depend on the rest of creation to live, to breathe, to have our existence. None of us could live without any other creatures. We can't even breathe without algae and trees and other plants that take in our poison, our carbon dioxide, and photosynthesize to give us food and clean oxygen, right? We can't live without water. We can't live without plant and animal life that sustains us, that keeps us going, and so on and so on and so on. But do we recognize that reciprocity? In some ways, I feel like as a species, that anthropocentrism is we take and we take and we take, and we're not mindful of the way in which we're called to give in turn. Francis of Assisi was somebody who was very aware of this. St. Bonaventure writes, let also the devotion of the faithful, that is us, the faithful, the believers, weigh how the piety in God's servant Francis was of such marvelous power and of such abundant sweetness that even the nature of animals acknowledged it in their own way. It's not that St. Francis just loved the birds and loved animals and deer and was kind of like a medieval hippie. It was that he recognized that truly, when we talk about a community of creation, we're really talking about a family, that we depend on one another. And the question is, how are our choices, how are our decisions, how are our actions governed by the fact that the rest of creation cares for us? What do we do in return? Care for creation, then, according to this virtue of pietas, is not something we do, again, out of obligation, duty, or command, right? Stewards are good or bad stewards, and they're hired for a job. That's their responsibility. The duty comes from without. Pietas says the duty comes from within. We do it as fellow family members, just as one would care for their child, sibling, or parent. And as I've mentioned, in truth, the rest of creation is already caring for us. What kind of sisters and brothers are we in turn to the rest of our creaturely kin? So how are we to live, right? What does it mean? How does it look to live pietas? Well, we're meant to live in this virtue, in this spirit of care and concern for the rest of creation and for one another. I think, it shifts our whole way of thinking, our whole way of seeing the world in a new light if we allow ourselves to recognize that our care for the rest of creation, our concern for non-human creatures isn't just about us, but is also a care and concern for the rest of creation for its own sake. And that God has a relationship to all God's creatures, independent of us. We have a place within it too, and we relate to God for sure. But how do we ever think about how God relates to the rest of creation, or how interconnected we are? And the next time you go for a walk outside, socially distant, of course, at this time, do you look at the trees? Do you look at the blades of grass? Do you look and see the ways in which you are tied to these creatures? Oftentimes, we don't go about thinking about this at all. And yet that blade of grass is taking in the poison that I'm breathing out right now and turning it into oxygen, into fruit, into plant life, and giving that oxygen back to us. The next breath you take was made possible by the care and support of our interrelated creatureliness with the rest of creation. So there's a lot more to say, but I'm mindful of the time that we have. And so I'm thankful for your attention. And at this point, I think we'll maybe take some questions. Yeah, I'll look to Tom, I think, who is fielding these if we have them. Yeah.
Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, so we have a quick question here from John. Father Dan, if you could speak about how Pope Francis included or incorporated thinking and writing from non-European sources.
Yeah, thank you, John, for that. That's a really great observation. One of the things that Pope Francis does in Laudato Si, and as a theology professor, one of the things I always love to do with any kind of article or book or church teaching is to look at the footnotes. Let's see what are the sources that are being used. And John's right to point out that the Pope does a couple things. One is points to the wisdom of indigenous communities and traditions, wisdom traditions that predate in many ways even the existence of Christianity. So I mentioned earlier First Nations people, which is what our Canadian neighbors refer to the indigenous peoples of those lands, or we in the US oftentimes refer to our Native brothers and sisters as Native Americans. What are the wisdom traditions? What are the insights about how we relate to the rest of creation, how creation cares and takes care of the human family as well? How are these things tied together? Pope Francis highlights the fact that there's a lot we can learn. There's a whole section in Laudato Si where the Holy Father talks about dialogue. He says religion, Christianity needs a dialogue with science, needs a dialogue with philosophy, needs a dialogue with politics. But he also says we need to dialogue with and learn from a lot of these wisdom traditions. And more recently, Pope Francis and the Synod of Bishops on the Pan-Amazon region do likewise. They build on the same idea that not only does Christianity, does the church find itself enculturated, right? That we find ourselves expressing our Christian faith with all we bring in terms of our ethnic heritage, in terms of our culture, in terms of our societies and histories, but we can learn as well from the elders and from the wisdom traditions that precede us. So that's an important thing, the non-European sources. The second thing, along the same line that Pope Francis highlights in the non-European source kind of venue or way of thinking, is the way in which Laudato Si draws from regional conferences of bishops around the globe. So Pope Francis isn't just drawing on European theologians or texts or documents, which oftentimes happens in church documents, to be quite honest, that they'll be very self-referential, right? They'll refer to, another Pope's documents, and the Holy Father does that for sure. Benedict XVI and John Paul II and John the 23rd and Leo XIII and so forth. But he also draws from local bishops' conferences, the bishops of Asia, the bishops of South America, the bishops of the United States, the Philippine bishops, the bishops in South Africa. And here he's getting insights and theological reflection and wisdom from all corners of the world. And truthfully, that's the way we should proceed, because Catholicism, Christianity, is not just a European reality. It's not just a North American reality. It is a global reality. We are a global church. So John, I thank you for highlighting that. And I think it's a great model for all of us to continue to develop our own understanding of our faith and of how we're called to act in the world, drawing from sources that are not just the ones we're most comfortable or familiar with, but from all perspectives.
Great. I have another one for you, Father Dan. Before I get to that one, I'd like to ask a question.
Sure.
So I work with the youth in our diocese and youth ministers, and we had some really in-depth and kind of deep stuff that you went into here that I loved. I would love to share, like later in the week, we're interpreting a lot of these teachings for young people so that they understand it, What are I'm sure there's the 6 main points. What will be two great points that I can make and for the youth in a language that they could understand? And in a way, if they have people, family that don't think the way they do, they could actually, share that information with others,
Yeah, Tom, I really appreciate that. I think the first thing is that by and large, young people, both in the US context and abroad, globally, tend to be a little bit more attuned to some of these realities than other generations. And that's not a dig on other generations, but it's really to highlight the fact that there are a couple different things. One is the kind of access that young people have to information and social media. They're more attuned to perspectives, more attuned to some of the information that's taking place in a broader perspective. But also this notion of intergenerational justice that John Paul II talked about and Pope Francis highlights, that as the young activist Greta Thunberg often highlights, this is their future. They're going to be alive. This is going to be their reality. It's people who are your children and their children, your grandchildren, who are going to have to deal with the continued effects of global climate change. So I'm glad that you highlight that, this is really important for young people. In terms of two things, I think the first one is, I find that people oftentimes don't intuit, and again, because of this kind of deeply ingrained anthropocentrism, don't intuit how automatically, how unthinkingly interdependent and dependent we are on the rest of creation. So one of the things that's a big takeaway from the teaching of Laudato Si and carrying it forward into our faith and into our practice is to pause and reflect on how am I even living right now, to be present to the world around us, to be present to the source of our food, the source of our clothing, the source of our habitat, the source of our oxygen, for instance, the source of our water supply and so forth. How are we already tied to the rest of creation in terms of its care for us? And conversely, what are the ways that I individually, or me and my family, or me and my community, or me and my nation are impacting the rest of creation? So I think that's one takeaway that young people could really appreciate and latch onto, and of all ages, again, just a walk outside and reflecting on even just a reflection on one's day. What did you have for breakfast? Where did that come from? You didn't photosynthesize it, right? You didn't make it from the sun and from carbon dioxide and from nitrogen in the ground, right? So, and that's true for vegans and vegetarians and omnivores as well, whether you're eating animal meat or whether you're eating vegetables. That's one thing. Tied to that is a little practice, and this is where maybe some spirituality comes in that I invite us to consider in the spirit of John's earlier question about non-European sources. And that is, you know, a lot of our Native American sisters and brothers have had traditions of acknowledging the life that was given when consuming animal or plant life in a meal, right? Whether that's in hunting practices and so forth. I think as Christians, we're inclined at times to offer grace before meals, to pray, and then we thank God, and rightfully so, for the food we're about to receive. But do we acknowledge the life that was given by the rest of creation so that we might live as part of the natural kind of, you know, the natural run of things in creation? You know, other creatures need to die that we might live. And in, I think in a more traditional sort of world, where we don't necessarily have embalming practices and cement burial tombs and so forth, we would decompose and we would be providing life for other creatures as well. It reminds me of what Jesus tells his disciples in John's gospel, which is that there's no greater love than this, than to lay down one's life for a friend. And so I think there are ways we can incorporate little spiritual practices. And it may be something as simple as thanking not only God for what we've received in our meals and in our lives, but thanking the rest of creation as well. And that's not, again, just to be clear, in case people are uncomfortable, I know it sounds a little bit uncomfortable. You're probably thinking, oh, this hippy-dippy Franciscan, but it's absolutely true. It's scientifically, factually true that we need other creatures in order to live. And so maybe that will help us to think a little bit about our place within this community of creation as well, to be more appreciative. So those are two little takeaways I suggest.
Great. I'm thinking the Lion King here.
The circle of life. Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's kind of the theme song of that. And you know, well, there's more I could say about the anthropocentrism. You know that.
Well, actually, it's. I have a question from Mag, and it goes along that line, asking about anthropocentrism. If maybe let me ask this for you.
Sure.
How can we? So Mag, first off, she says, "Thank you, Father Horan. You're awesome." So,
thanks, very kind.
I figured that you need a little love. How can we begin a dialogue with those who are indifferent, perhaps because of anthropocentrism? And I'll give you the second part because I know you can handle it. And how about dialoguing with Catholics who might see this as a politically divisive topic, as opposed to a topic related to the gospel and the care of the poor? And that's along the lines of the social justice as well.
Yeah. So yeah, there's so much there. I really appreciate that, Mag, and thank you for your very kind remarks. I mean, I think that the first thing is the anthropocentrism. There are a couple different ways you might approach it. I mean, again, I like what Marika said at the very beginning of our time together this afternoon, where she said, you know, be kind in the chat, be kind to one another. I think that's a starting point, that we also need to be kind and patient, particularly with those who might have different views, recognizing that we live in a time where there's a lot of fractured information sources, and that not all information is entirely sound. For people who tend to appreciate kind of clarity and authority, I think Laudato Si is incredibly helpful because it has the same weight as other teachings, and sometimes difficult teachings in the church. And there are things that some people struggle with that the church teaches, and I understand that, and we need to pastorally accompany each other in that. And this may be one of them. But to say that, look, this may be a hard teaching for you for whatever reason, because of what you're hearing on the radio or what you're reading on the internet, or because of a resistance you have internally. But nevertheless, this is what we're called to. And then, you know, an entry point might be those three approaches to thinking about our relationship to the rest of creation as a species. And to say that, you know, a lot of people might be uncomfortable with identifying that anthropocentrism and feel like it's merited, that we should be the center of creation, that God created this world for us. And in that case, you can say, well, that's not what the church teaches. The church makes very clear in paragraph 67, right? The Holy Father says explicitly, this understanding of human domination of non-human creation is not an authentic reading of Scripture from the church. So I think that's an entry point, and to say, what are the other ways we can think about who we are and what the rest of creation is? And to ask, you know, because I think this isn't just dialogical, like you're rightly saying, and I think it's a great question, but it's also an internal examination, right? Pope Francis calls for an ecological conversion. And it's not to go out beating people over the head. That's not what conversion means. Conversion begins within ourselves. And so it may mean, what am I uncomfortable with? Why do I find myself indifferent? Why don't I care? Why am I resistant to this? And if one does the work of an examination of conscience in that way, if one does the work of openness to the Spirit's transforming us in this way, then we might be more sympathetic and open to having conversations with others and say, hey, look, pal, I know I was very uncomfortable with this too, but let me tell you about how I've come to see it. That's one thing. The second thing I would say is about the political division where people, see this as a political issue. I mean, that is very unfortunate, and it's an unfortunate consequence of being a Catholic Christian in the U.S. context at this point in history. This is not the same thing, by and large, at other parts of the world. And prior to the global pandemic, where I've been, for our community here in Chicago for the last 2 months plus now, I've had the great privilege of being in lots of places around the world, and so I've seen this firsthand. That we're uniquely affected by political division on this kind of issue. And I don't need to get into some of the reasons why that's the case, but I will just say this from a Catholic perspective. We like to call ourselves a pro-life community, and we are, but we have to ask ourselves, what does that mean? If we're really for life, if we're for all life, then the effect of global climate change, the effect of pollution, the effect of species extinction, the fact that the poorest human beings, the most vulnerable among us, are the ones who are most immediately impacted by these ecological disasters. Remember that picture I showed at the beginning of, if we're pro-life, how do you live in a world in which people don't care about elderly people drowning in a nursing home in a flood, or homeless people who are exposed to the elements and so forth, right? These are all things that come under the heading of pro-life, of being for all life. We can't just be picking and choosing which lives we want to care for or are concerned about. And I think that's another way to kind of enter into this, that as Sister Elizabeth Johnson said in one of those quotes that I shared, if division, right, if polarization, of dualism, this either or mentality is not what's ideal, is not what God calls us to, but mutuality, support, care, love. This is, again, the whole message of God incarnate, Jesus Christ, right? Then this way of thinking, this way of being in the world is the only way to be in the world. And I'm not saying it's easy. I'm not saying I've got it down pat, but I am saying that this is what the Holy Father is calling us to embrace.
Very nice. Great. Let me ask you, let's see, we have one more question here so far. John, Bishop Doug, let's just try to give everybody a fair shake. So let's go to Bishop Doug here. Our faith and ecology group intends to be an interfaith group, but I think members often fall away from our group because, in spite of Pope Francis's concerted effort to be ecumenical in his presentation of Laudato Si, so many of the proponents of Laudato Si feel proudly possessive of the concept and somehow lord it over so often. So I think Bishop Doug is feeling what a lot of groups are feeling, they're ecumenical. Certain ones take that power position within there. So he's probably asking if you feel that's true.
Yeah, so if I'm understanding Bishop Doug's question there, I think the issue is that the Catholics in the group seem to take an ownership over the church's teaching, or over Laudato Si, in a way that can be kind of exclusive, or dominating, as it were, lording it over others. Thank you, Bishop Doug. I see the yes there. Yeah. Well, what I would say about this is, then our Catholic sisters and brothers need to read the text more closely and look at the footnotes, because one of the things that Pope Francis does right in the introduction is situate Laudato Si not only within Catholic social teaching, right? Because of his universal teaching authority, because he is the Bishop of Rome, and again, first among equal in the College of Bishops, Bishop Doug, he has this universal teaching authority, and he can situate this teaching for the whole church as he does. And he shows very, very well, of course, how he builds on his predecessors, recent predecessors like Paul VI, JP2, Benedict XVI, and so forth. But he also is very ecumenical. He has a whole paragraph where he really applauds some of our Orthodox brothers and sisters, like Ecumenical Patriarch Bartholomew, who is oftentimes called the Green Patriarch, right? Somebody who has been leading the way. And he draws from not only bishops' conferences of the Catholic Church around the globe, but sources that are Christian and non-Christian alike, And so I think there is a call. I appreciate the question. There's a real call for us as Catholics, to humility, to recognize that there's a lot in this document that is applicable and inspirational for women and men of all different traditions. And this is not just ours to kind of greedily hold on to, but should be, as far as Catholics are concerned, a touchstone for shaping our approach kind of outward. So we should think of it in terms of, it's not for us to kind of predicate or to hit over the heads of others, but it should be something that we incorporate into our own faith tradition and lives, and then lead by example, which I think is Pope Francis's greatest teaching, right? For as much as he's an eloquent preacher, for as much as he's a very compassionate writer and an eloquent writer, his documents tend to be more easily digestible than some of his predecessors, who tend to be philosophers and kind of academic theologians. His greatest teaching has been in his pastoral accompaniment and embrace of people. And he does that humbly, he does that in an approachable way. And so I think that would be my recommendation, is that Laudato Si isn't something that we can prize as our own secret possession, but it's something that we should use to shape our way of looking at the world and therefore model for others.
As if it's a gift. We'll get one more from John here. I'm going to rephrase it a little bit. I think I think John is asking a comment on, so we know Pope Francis is a scientist, right?
Mm-hmm.
And John feels that, and which is true, a lot of people think, well, there has to be, you have to turn away from technology to embrace, Laudato Si and caring for our earth. Is this a view that the Pope discusses in his encyclical at some point?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry there, Tom, what was that last part?
Despair that it can't be done, the two can't exist together, that kind of
Yeah, so I did kind of brush over that quickly. Pope Francis does spend some time on this, and it's much more nuanced. He actually draws on the work of his predecessor, Pope Benedict XVI, in a number of his documents, including his encyclical Caritatis in Veritate and Deus Caritas Est, both of them really. He also talks about technology. And Benedict XVI, I have to give him a shout out because he has a background similar to mine. We're both systematic theologians, so shout out to theology professors. And so he thinks, very, very logically and in very, very detailed ways. And one of the contributions that Benedict XVI really offers the church around technology is he says that technology in and of itself is neither good nor bad. That's really important because he says, our society, particularly in our commercialized society, the presumption is that every new technology is inherently good. And it's built on this false sense of progress. Like every new development, every new iPhone, every new whatever, computer or app or program is inherently good. That's the presumption. And what he's saying is that's not the case. At best, technology is a reflection of our co-creative gift that God has given us, using our intellect, our knowledge, our skills, our imagination, our creativity. That's all really good and can be used for good. Pope Benedict gave this great talk, I want to say in 2008, but it's been so long now I can't remember off the top of my head, where he was talking on World Day of Communications, and he says, actually, the internet is an interesting place because it's like a digital continent that needs evangelists, that needs people like a new continent that's never heard the gospel before. So how can we go and present the gospel where we find ourselves in this digital space? Really kind of clever. But then he also says that it's a mistake for us to approach technology in an uncritical way. And that's where the caution comes in, the kind of pumping the brakes a little bit. And Pope Francis builds on that. And he says, a lot of the problems we have today, whether it's, the rise in carbon in the atmosphere, whether it's pollution, whether it's the consequences of mountaintop removal or the extinction of species, or like we see in places like Flint, Michigan, or we see in places where there's hydrofracking and there are, waterways and water tables that are polluted and so forth. All these things are the direct result of the use of technology, and perhaps sometimes the uncritical use of it. And so what Pope Francis says is technology can still be good, but we cannot blindly assume that technology is going to get us out of this problem, that we should just adopt every new technology. And I'll give you one example, if I may. And this is the one I was thinking of earlier, but didn't want to take up too much time. And that is the process of desalinization. So for those who aren't familiar with that, the issue is, and an example in the US context takes place in California about 10 years ago. California was in the midst of about a 5 or 6 year, very, very serious drought. You may recall this, particularly in Southern California, and actually in the Central Coast where there's a lot of agriculture. And the water tables, that hadn't rained really in years. And there just wasn't water anymore. And there were some very serious concerns and restrictions. Part of that has obviously ricocheted and kind of dominoed to the great wildfire problems that California experiences these days. But one of the proposals, again, California is also the hub of kind of technological innovation. And one of the proposals was desalinization plants. So you would have these factories that would take seawater. I mean, you have the Pacific Ocean, the largest body of water in the world, but it's all salt water. And so the idea is you would pump that salt water into a plant that would take the salt out of the water so that you had fresh water to water crops and to nourish the people who lived in this state. Well, that sounds good at first glance, but here's the question. How do you power such plants? How are you where do you get this tremendous amount of energy to do this very complicated, very labor-intensive chemical process? And the hard truth answer is from coal burning plants, from nuclear energy, from other things that also run their own risk of global climate change and environmental degradation and so forth. So this is one of those examples of just because we can do it, is it the best way to do it? Is it the right thing to do? And I think that's where the Holy Father talks about discernment around technology in particular. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but I hope the desalinization example illustrates it for you.
That's very good. It's all quiet here, Father Dan, so I think that's it for questions for now.
Thank you, Tom. I appreciate it. And thank you, everyone who asked the question. I appreciate that.
Thank you so much, Father Dan. Just wanted to, maybe what we can do now is conclude with the prayer, and I believe you had that on slides. And
I do. So this will be brief. This comes from the Holy Father himself. This is at the end of Laudato Si, and I'll share that with you right now. And I'll read it, and folks you can read along, follow along, and together we pray. Father, we praise you with all your creatures. They came forth from your all-powerful hand. They are yours, filled with your presence and your tender love. Praise be to you. Son of God, Jesus, through you all things were made. You were formed in the womb of Mary, our mother. You became part of this earth, and you gazed upon this world with human eyes. Today, you are alive in every creature in your risen glory. Praise be to you. Holy Spirit, by your light, you guide this world towards the Father's love and accompany creation as it groans in travail. You also dwell in our hearts, and you inspire us to do what is good. Praise be to you. Triune Lord, wondrous community of infinite love, teach us to contemplate you in the beauty of the universe, for all things speak of you. Awaken our praise and thankfulness for every being that you have made. Give us the grace to feel profoundly joined to everything that is. God of love, show us our place in this world as channels of your love for all the creatures of this earth, for not one of them is forgotten in your sight. Enlighten those who possess power and money, that they may avoid the sin of indifference, that they may love the common good, advance the weak, and care for this world in which we live. The poor and the earth are crying out. O Lord, seize us with your power and light. Help us to protect all life, to prepare for a better future, for the coming of your kingdom of justice, peace, love, and beauty. Praise be to you. And we say, amen.
thank you so much, Father Dan. What I would like to do is just share with everybody else the rest of the week.